Maria was born in 1989 and she grew up in Puerto Rico. Her early life was a happy childhood, beautiful as a little girl, enjoyed her high school years. Lots of freckles as she got older.
Maria's parents divorced when she was a little bit younger, and it was definitely difficult for her.
She was sort of devastated, and that was kind of her goal, is to marry the love of her life and never have to divorce ever.
Maria was going to nursing school in Puerto Rico. She saw a life and a future with Joel.
She was enamored because he gave her so much attention. Her sister and her father had some cautions because of his age. He was 10 years older than her, but Maria saw someone who had set goals and dreams, and he sold those dreams to her.
Maria and Joel were married back in 2010. It was a beautiful occasion. Maria looked beautiful.
Maria and Joel had goals to come to the mainland.
Joel was training to become a CRNA, which is a certified registered nurse anesthetist.
You're not trained as a doctor, it's not as much schooling, but the pay is very high. Maria and Joel were excited to welcome their first son into the world. He was a beautiful little boy.
That was something that Maria was over the moon about. Her calling was to be a mother.
Joel had a very good paying job, and that enabled Maria to be able to stay at home, which she enjoyed, devoting her time to her firstborn son. Maria and I first met at a ladies' night. There was a woman in our church that hosted a ladies' bowling night. So we met at one of those arcades. She looked at me and she said, "So you're the pastor's wife?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And she said, "So tell me about God." We became friends right away, and we just never looked back.
I'm like freaking out here.
When I first met Maria, I thought she was incredibly bubbly. She was very happy, very animated, incredibly warm and friendly. You could tell she was wholly in love with her husband, loved her be in a loving marriage. You could have fun with them. Joel appeared to be a supportive and proud dad and engaged dad. 2017, Maria had gotten pregnant, and very shortly after, she had had a miscarriage. And this was really difficult for Maria.
Joel didn't really understand what happened and thought somehow that the miscarriage was her fault. And that didn't help her state of mind. Maria was so excited to be pregnant again, just a short time after her miscarriage. You could just see a glow about her while she was pregnant.
Maria had her second son in 2018, and she was ecstatic.
Joelle seemed excited, but this is a time where she started to feel some distance. He started to be more secretive, and that sort of made her nervous that maybe she was doing something wrong.
At this point in Maria's life, what she wanted was to feel the completion of her family, but Joel was nowhere to be seen. Joel had a 5-year goal that he obsessively spoke about, and so he devoted himself to work, took overtime whenever he could.
Maria talked about a lot of the changes going on in Joel's life. She kept saying that he's so different now that they moved to Laredo. He started bulking up so fast that it seemed abnormal to me. Both of us suspected there was some supplements going on, probably a lot of testosterone. In January of 2019, Joel asked for a break from their marriage. He just was not happy with the way things were going. And so he decided he was just gonna move out and stay with a friend. And that was a really hard time for her. But she would often tell me that she had 10 good years of marriage and she didn't want to throw it away, all because of this 1 year where he's just acting insane.
Her goal was always for her family to stay together no matter what.
I want to support him. Be his rock. Because I know he needs it.
Maria liked to keep a journal. When Joel started being more distant, it really helped her to get her thoughts on paper.
How can I support someone who's always making me small? A piece of nothing. Not enough.
At the point that Maria and Joel were separated, he would come home to spend a little bit of time not just with her, but with the boys.
He would expect her to still wash his clothes, and he would convince her that they needed to have sex to continue to protect the marriage. I told her that it's not your job to do his laundry, and it's definitely not your job to be intimate with him while he's breaking up the marriage. In March of 2019, Maria was doing his laundry. She found a plane ticket. She never even knew he went to Spain. She just knew in her heart that something was terribly wrong and he had not been honest at all during this whole time. Maria finally worked up the courage to confront Joel about this plane ticket.
Joel admitted to having an affair. She was a nurse at one of the hospitals that he was working at.
Her name was Janet Arredondo, and he had taken her on a trip to Spain. Maria was devastated, but at the same time, I think she expected this answer.
At this point, Joel broke down. He told Maria that he wanted to keep his family, he wanted to be with her, he would break up with the girlfriend. True to Maria, she gave Joel another chance. She would do anything to get her family back.
It seemed like such a back and forth during that time that Joel would tell her one weekend that he stopped the affair, and then a couple days later he would change his tune and walk back out. He wanted both women, and so the only way to get that was to string both of them along. And that was really just almost too much for her to bear.
My experience with Joel was that he was emotionally abusive. Joel was confident, what I perceived as narcissistic, and he was kind of domineering. He was like a dominant authority in the household.
One day, I was with Maria at the coffee shop, and Joel agreed to meet her there. When we were in line, there was a guy that sort of hit on her. Joel was extremely agitated, angry, and vividly upset that someone had hit on his wife. When he started to get angry with her, I told him that he had no right to tell her that she was wearing the wrong thing or that she invited the attention when he was having an affair with another woman. I am a bolder personality than Maria was, and he started to get nervous of the influence that me and her other friends had on her, that she might become bold one day. He started to discourage her from seeing me.
Maria loved Jesus so much, and she didn't want to break up her family for fear of God. What I told her was that biblically, he had gotten to the point where she had every right to leave the marriage.
Don't put that on me.
What are you talking about?
There was an argument that they had in the car at one point, and Maria recorded it unbeknownst to Joel.
What? Because it feels like you're like, okay, look, if I stay in the house, I'm gonna be frustrated. Frustration led me to be unfaithful to you in the past.
Maybe.
No, it led me.
Maybe.
You said it.
Because I think
Okay.
that
So
possibly.
Okay.
Maria was talking to Joel about his unfaithfulness.
What do you have to say?
Nothing.
So what do you want me to do with that?
With what?
With nothing.
I don't know. It's up to you.
No, Papa. You walk out that door, we're getting a divorce.
All right, fine. You got it.
I have to realize that Joel that I knew and fell in love with isn't the Joel I am dealing with. I love him, but I don't need to accept none of this.
In the summer of 2020, Maria was beginning to see that there might not be a future with Joel.
Maria finally realized that Joel was not getting better. He wasn't getting rid of his affair, and he wasn't going to stop the lying and the dishonesty. And I think she finally started to picture a life without him. She wanted to be independent. Maria had the goal of becoming a nurse in Texas. She needed to pass her nursing exam to get her degree.
She was making plans to be able to provide for the children on her own.
Take 1,000.
She had hobbies and things she enjoyed doing.
I have been wanting to do a YouTube channel for quite a while.
She was doing hair and makeup tutorials.
I would probably grab like a little bit by little. Maybe that can help you, Gabby.
She was so beautiful in the way that she would play around with her makeup.
Whew, I like it. Just makes you look more awake. There's nothing like a good mascara and a good bronzer to make you feel good, right?
In September of 2020, Maria found Joel's phone and was able to access a bunch of messages between him and Janet. Really just showed her that he was in a full-blown affair and they were having sex.
That was the moment that she saw it with her own eyes, and that her very, very determined spirit came out.
Maria confronted Joel, and I think Joel started to see a different Maria. She was saying, hey, I'm done, and I'm not gonna listen to your lies anymore. So he told her, I'm gonna stop seeing Janet for real this time. We're gonna move to Dallas, and that will prove to you that I'm willing to put her away. Maria was skeptical, but at the same time, he had never offered to move away from his girlfriend before. Part of her wanted to believe that it could be true. Maria was very excited to tell me about how their marriage was going to turn around, and so we agreed to meet. However, before she came to my house, she gave me a phone call and said that she was going to be late. And she said, I called Joel and I heard a dog barking in the background, and I think it was Janet's. I think he lied to me again. I'm going to stop by the house and just make sure. I told her that I didn't think it was wise for her to stop over there, that nothing good was going to come from it, but she said she just couldn't help herself. She had to. When Maria arrived at Janet's house, she saw that his car was there. She got out of the car and decided to confront them both. When Maria arrived at Janet's house and saw that Joel's car was there, she was very angry. She had just been played again. Janet used the Ring app to kind of talk to her and say that she needed to leave right away or she would call the police.
Maria was incredibly upset and wasn't going to go anywhere until she had spoken to her husband. When Joel finally emerges, he tells Maria that he's chosen Janet, and I can't even imagine what was going through her head when hours earlier he had been telling a different story.
Joel told Maria to go get in the car and that they would drive to the park and they would just hash it out. When Maria and Joel were at the park, he got so angry that he smashed her windshield with his fist, and it just shattered. Meanwhile, Janet called the police. The police responded fairly quickly.
Hello, ma'am, did you call police?
Yes, I did.
What's going on? You gotta get up. What happened?
I had a woman come by that she was already told not to be here, so I had already filed a...
Trespass warning?
Yes.
Okay.
She was here, she was asked to leave, she refused, so I told you guys.
Let me make a phone call then, and hopefully she'll answer. If not, well, that's the only way I can warn her.
Hey, I'm talking to you right now. Hang up the phone.
I guess that's your boyfriend.
They called Maria, and Joel, you can hear him screaming. He couldn't believe she answered the phone while they were talking.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
I'll try one more time.
Janet started texting Joel to be quiet, to let him know it was the police calling.
Hello?
Oh, yes, sir, I'm looking for Maria Munoz.
Yeah, she's here. I'm having a conversation with her.
All right, this is Officer Jalomo, Laredo PD, sir.
Yeah,
I'm calling on behalf of Janetta Redondo. Can I speak to her?
sure.
Thank you.
After receiving the text from Janet, Joel knew it was going to be the police, and instantly he was a calm, collected person.
Hello?
Yes, Miss Munoz.
Mm-hmm.
Man, this is Officer Jalomo, Laredo PD.
Yes?
Okay, I understand you came over to Miss Redondo's house earlier today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you to not return. If not, you will be placed into custody.
Okay.
After the police hung up with her, Maria drove over to my house. She was very upset. She was almost hysterical. She told me that she was finally ready to move on, for real this time. No more getting lied to. I saw her the next day at church, and even though she was sad, she was determined that this was the thing that she had to do. Later that day, she sent him a text and let him know she was not going to go after him anymore. She let him know that for them to be legally separated, an attorney needed to be involved in that.
Joel's response was that he didn't want any lawyers involved. His concern lied in finances. He really didn't want Maria to go through with it because that would cost him.
He had responded initially on Sunday, but then on Monday, he had a different response, and he sent it through email. Again, he gave implication that there was hope for their marriage. I didn't believe any of it, and yet somehow I could not convince her to say no to this meeting. He agreed to meet around 7, and I told her to contact me as soon as he arrived, as soon as he left. She agreed to do that. I believe it was 9:30 when I had not heard from her. He showed up already much later than he was supposed to. He should have been gone by then. I started to pray that the conversation would go well.
There, 911 with the address of emergency.
Oh, I'm on my life on my responses.
And, kind of scared that she's not breathing. There, 911 with the address of emergency.
Oh, I'm on my life on my responses.
And, kind of scared if she's not breathing. She may have taken some pills.
Okay, sir. And do you know what kind of pills they were?
Yeah, clonazepam.
On September 22nd, 2020, the Laredo Police Department received a 911 call for unresponsive female. I was the first officer on scene. So as I approached the house, I see a male subject at the doorway.
What's going on?
He just turns around and bolts right into the residence.
What's going on?
So I followed quickly behind him.
What's going on?
His name was Joel Peor. Female is his wife, Maria Munoz.
What'd you take?
I think clonazepam.
Good.
She's been pretty depressed lately.
I hear the paramedics, the ambulance get to the scene. They had their lights and sirens. Paramedics continued CPR, and I see no changes in her body. She's not getting any better.
Under control.
No, she's not. She's been down for a while.
The paramedics on scene determined that Maria was deceased at 1:50 a.m.
That's fine. Confirmed 82. What's going on? What happened?
I started getting very suspicious about Joel. His pupils are just really big. I see that he's sweating profusely.
Just have a seat over here.
She's been super depressed. I've been ignoring her. We're going through some problems. And I came to talk to her, like literally just talking.
So you're not staying here right now?
I'm like, this doesn't make sense. If he doesn't live here, what is he doing here at 1 o'clock in the morning?
We had sex, we took a shower, and while she was like knocked out. I didn't think anything of it, so just kept on doing my thing. And then I go back upstairs and she just...
He starts crying, but it's a really fake cry. It didn't add up to me. I didn't like where it was going.
That's 37. Yeah, it's really 37.
I told him, hey, this is very 37, which is means suspicious in police jargon.
We gotta talk to you, okay? Come on, just, you gotta go inside.
So I arrived at the scene shortly after 2 a.m. Once I got the authorization and consent to go into the home, I did do a brief walkthrough. I see Maria, her body is there. Joelle insinuated that she had overdosed on a bottle of pills, bottle of clonazepam. Whenever somebody takes a bottle of pills, they foam from the mouth. I noticed that Maria was not foaming from the mouth. When they did the examination of Maria's body, my partners discovered a track mark, or like a puncture, on her arm. It looked like she had just gone to get her blood drawn. And then they also discovered a bag of medical supplies. Inside that bag were needles, catheters, and 4 to 5 bottles of medications. I immediately suspected that there was more to this than what Joelle was saying. We transported Joelle to the police department. It was a voluntary interview. When I arrived at the station, I could hear him screaming. So much so that I had to tell the officer to tell him to calm down. When I entered the room, my interview at that point was that of a grieving spouse.
What's going on, man? I'm really depressed because so glad we got separated.
Joelle wanted to make it clear that Maria was depressed and was not taking the separation well.
So you said that Maria was taking pills for depression. Were they prescribed to her? Yeah, they were. And hers ran out, so mine were recently given to me. So I just went to give her some. Yeah, 1 milligram of clonazepam.
According to Joelle, he had a prescription bottle for the same type of medication. So he allowed Maria to take some of his pills.
When I checked the pills, 2 pills, you know, she took 4.
He wanted me to think that Maria was so depressed that she had taken a bottle of clonazepam and that she committed suicide.
I saw a track mark on her. Okay. Did she inject herself with anything that you know of? Would she inject herself with anything? And if she did, what would it be? You know? Did you inject her tonight? No. With anything? No.
By the end of that interview, I didn't suspect that Maria had taken any pills. When we looked at the needle puncture wound, the medical equipment at home, I suspected that Joelle, with his knowledge of anesthesia, had killed his wife. So at the end of that interview, Joelle was released. There was no evidence to charge him.
For her life.
The key piece of evidence that was pending for us to rule out suicide, to rule out overdose, was a toxicology report.
As soon as we received that, we knew what caused her death.
The toxicology report routinely takes a few months. And in January 2021, we received the report.
The first thing we looked was to see how much clonazepam she had. And it was striking that she didn't have any clonazepam in her system.
1 milligram of clonazepam.
He said clonazepam and she had none in her system. So then we reviewed the other drugs that were in her system. It was Versed, ketamine, and morphine. Propofol, Narcan, lidocaine, and Demerol.
So all these drugs, what they have in common is that they're normally used for anesthesia. I was familiar with propofol because that's known as what ultimately killed Michael Jackson.
Propofol takes effect immediately. The second it hits your bloodstream, you fall asleep. So it's impossible for you to self-administer propofol. Someone else has to administer propofol. So we knew it was not an overdose. We believed that we had the proof to show murder.
Police, or we're gonna break down the door. Go ahead and grab me back. Joel Peyote was arrested and charged with the murder officially on January 16th, 2021.
Joel Peyote's trial started March 20th of 2023. The defense argued that Maria was a drug abuser who committed suicide because she was so depressed, and that Joel gave Maria an injection in an attempt to revive her. Maria's journals were critical to the case, so we could refute that she was suicidal.
Today my head will not look down. Today I will conquer. Today I am free. I am strong. I am confident. I am enough.
When I testified in court, I was able to read the journals to the jury and mention to the jury that suicide and depression had no bearing on this case whatsoever.
With all the accusations flying about suicide or trying to smear her, Maria was able to speak for herself on how she felt, what she thought, and share the hope that she had.
I love my life. I love who I am becoming.
Joel couldn't steal her voice from her like he thought he had. And it was beautiful.
It was important to give as much background information as we could to explain Joel and Maria's relationship. The prosecution team brought in a video that Maria had recorded without Joel knowing.
You walk out that door, we're getting a door.
We believed it was important to show that he's pretty cold about the pain that she's experiencing. We explained to the jury that on September 21st, 2020, Joel Peyote arrived to Maria's home with a bag of anesthetic drugs and IV equipment. He was wearing his scrubs because he had been at the hospital. So the evidence showed that she had high levels of caffeine in her system. We were able to describe to the jury that he probably showed up with a cup of coffee, and in that coffee, he likely included the oral anesthetic drugs, which is the ketamine, the Versed, and the morphine. And that would have incapacitated her. She would not have been able to resist him trying to put an IV on her to give her the additional drugs, lidocaine, propofol, Narcan, and Demerol. The levels of anesthetic drugs in her system were enough for 2 major surgeries. Joel knew that this was going to end her life.
And we are here for Maria Munoz, who wrote, "No matter what happens, I will be fine.
I will not let
Put my
my
head down. I will hold it high. I am unique. No one is me, and that is my superpower. I am enough, and all I need. I will always push and thrive. I will shine bright like a diamond in the sky. The woman who never gave up. Maria.
Joel Peyo was found guilty of murder and of tampering with the evidence.
When Joelle finally was convicted of murder, I was so relieved. I was grateful for Maria to get justice, but I was sad for her children.
I don't think that Joel has any real remorse for what he did. I think that he's a narcissist and a manipulator.
Being with Maria and Laredo was like having family there. She became like a sister to me. She always lifted my spirits, even when she was the one with tragedy in her life.
I think Joelle sold her a life of dreams and promised her the world. Maria was special, and she deserved so much more.
Okay. I'm not too sure, but oh, there you go. Mayra. Ha, hi. So I'm gonna do my hair for you guys to see.
Maria was like a ray of sunshine. She walked into a room and she lit everybody else up. I miss her laugh. I miss watching her run after her kids. I miss seeing her chase them and the joy that she had. We need more joy like that in this world.
The desert night in Mesa, Arizona, was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes a person believe nothing terrible could happen behind the walls of an ordinary home. The streets were calm. The houses stood beneath the endless Arizona sky, separated by driveways, small gardens, and carefully maintained neighborhoods where families lived their everyday lives. From the outside, everything appeared normal. Peaceful. Safe. But inside one of those homes, something unimaginable had already happened. A man who had spent years building a life filled with ambition, faith, friendships, and dreams was lying dead in his own bathroom. His name was Travis Alexander. He was only 30 years old. To many people who knew him, Travis was the kind of person who seemed destined for a bright future. He was energetic, confident, and always looking for ways to improve himself. He had a smile that made people feel comfortable, a sense of humor that could turn strangers into friends, and a determination that helped him overcome the difficult circumstances of his childhood. He had built himself from the ground up. He had created a successful career. He had surrounded himself with people who admired him. He had plans for the future. A future that would never come. On June 9, 2008, Travis Alexander's friends arrived at his home after becoming increasingly worried. He had missed important appointments. He had stopped responding to messages. For someone as responsible and organized as Travis, the silence felt wrong. At first, they hoped for a simple explanation. Maybe his phone was broken. Maybe he had fallen asleep. Maybe something unexpected had delayed him. But when they entered his home, they discovered a scene that would transform a quiet neighborhood in Arizona into the center of one of America's most talked about murder investigations. The man they knew was gone. And the person investigators believed responsible was someone who once claimed to love him more than anyone else. Her name was Jodi Arias. Their story had started years earlier with attraction, excitement, and promises of a future together. When Travis met Jodi in 2006 at a business conference in Las Vegas, there was nothing to suggest that their relationship would end in tragedy. At the beginning, it appeared like many modern romances. Two people from different backgrounds met at the right moment. Travis was a successful salesman searching for personal growth and stability. Jodi was a young photographer trying to find her place in the world. They were drawn to each other quickly, and their connection became intense. Friends later described the early days of their relationship as passionate. There were long conversations. There were emotional messages. There were moments when the two seemed completely focused on each other. Jodi became deeply involved in Travis's world. She embraced the same religious environment that was important to him. She changed parts of her life in an attempt to become closer to him and closer to the future she imagined they would share. But beneath the surface, something began to change. What started as affection slowly became complicated. What appeared to be devotion began to feel like dependence. And what looked like love began to show signs of something darker. Travis had dreams of marriage and family. He wanted a stable relationship built around his beliefs and values. But as time passed, he began to realize that he and Jodi wanted different things. Their personalities clashed. Their expectations were different. Their relationship became increasingly unstable. Eventually, in 2007, Travis decided to end their romantic relationship. For many couples, a breakup marks the end of a chapter. But for Travis and Jodi, it was not the end. It was only the beginning of a much darker chapter. Jodi struggled to accept that Travis was moving forward without her. Although they were no longer officially together, they continued communicating. They continued seeing each other privately. The connection between them remained complicated, filled with emotional highs and painful conflicts. People close to Travis later described moments that made them uncomfortable. They noticed that Jodi seemed unable to fully let go. They noticed that she wanted to remain a constant presence in his life. They noticed that Travis appeared increasingly frustrated by the situation. To those around him, the relationship had become something difficult to understand. How could two people who seemed so connected become trapped in a cycle of attraction, conflict, and emotional tension? That question would remain at the center of the investigation years later. Because when investigators began examining the final days of Travis Alexander's life, they discovered that the answer was hidden inside a relationship that had never truly ended. In early 2008, Travis was preparing for an important trip to Mexico. It was supposed to be an opportunity for him to continue growing professionally and personally. At one point, Jodi Arias had been expected to join him. But plans changed. Travis eventually decided to travel with someone else. For investigators, that decision became one of the important moments in understanding the emotional state surrounding the crime. Because for Jodi Arias, losing her place in Travis's future may have felt like losing control over the one person she had become deeply attached to. On June 4, 2008, Travis was at his home in Mesa. It was an ordinary day. A day that began like countless others. He had no idea that someone he once trusted would soon become connected to the most horrifying moment of his life. Later, investigators would uncover evidence suggesting that Jody had been inside his home that day. A digital camera would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Images recovered from the device would reveal moments from the final hours of Travis's life, showing that he and Jody had been together shortly before everything changed forever. But at the time, nobody knew what had happened inside that house. Nobody knew that a friendship, a romance, and a series of unresolved emotions had reached a devastating conclusion. The truth would slowly emerge through forensic evidence, interviews, and a trail of contradictions. And as investigators began searching for answers, one question would dominate everything. How could a relationship that began with attraction and affection end with one person dead and the other accused of murder? The story of Travis Alexander is not only a story about a crime scene. It is a story about warning signs that were ignored. About emotions that became impossible to control. About the thin line between love and obsession. And about a man whose life was taken away just as he was building the future he always wanted. Before the headlines. Before the courtroom cameras. Before millions of people around the world knew the name Jodi Arias. There was simply Travis Alexander. A son. A friend. A person with dreams. A man who believed he still had many years ahead of him. But on one terrible night in Arizona, those dreams came to an end. And the investigation that followed would reveal one of the most disturbing and unforgettable murder cases in modern American true crime history. Before the tragedy that would make their names known across America, Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias were simply two people searching for something they believed they had not yet found. One was a man who had transformed himself from a difficult childhood into a symbol of determination and success. The other was a woman searching for identity, connection, and a place where she felt valued. Their paths crossed in a moment that seemed ordinary. But sometimes, the most devastating stories begin in the most ordinary places. In 2006, Las Vegas was filled with the energy that had made it famous. The bright lights, crowded streets, and endless movement created a city where millions of people arrived every year hoping to discover something new about themselves. Among the visitors attending a business conference that year were Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias. Travis was already known among his friends as someone who was constantly trying to improve his life. He was not someone who accepted his circumstances as permanent. His childhood had been marked by challenges, instability, and difficult experiences, but instead of allowing those hardships to define him, Travis used them as motivation. He wanted more. He wanted success. He wanted respect. Most importantly, he wanted to become someone who could inspire others. Those who knew Travis often described him as a person who could enter a room and immediately change the atmosphere. He was outgoing and confident, but he was also deeply focused on personal growth. He enjoyed talking with people, sharing ideas, and encouraging others to chase their goals. His career reflected that personality. Travis worked in sales, a profession where confidence, communication, and the ability to connect with people were essential. He was good at what he did because he understood how to make people feel heard. To many people around him, Travis represented the idea that a person could overcome their past and build something better. But behind his professional success was also a man searching for emotional stability. He wanted a family. He wanted a meaningful relationship. He wanted a future built on commitment and shared values. His faith played a major role in his life. Travis was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church. His religious beliefs influenced many of his decisions and shaped the type of life he hoped to create. He was not simply looking for temporary excitement. He was looking for permanence. For Jodi Arias, life had taken a different path. Born in California, Jodi grew up in a family environment that would later become part of discussions surrounding her personality and behavior. She was creative and artistic, developing an interest in photography. She had a desire to express herself and create a career connected to her talents. When she met Travis, she was at a point in her life where she was searching for direction. To her, Travis represented many things at once. He was successful. He was confident. He appeared to know exactly who he was and where he was going. For someone still trying to define herself, that confidence could be incredibly attractive. Their first interactions quickly developed into something intense. They talked. They connected. They discovered similarities. And soon, what began as a meeting at a conference became a romantic relationship. At first, those around them saw only the positive side. They saw two people who seemed excited about each other. They saw two people enjoying the beginning of a relationship. They saw chemistry. But relationships are rarely defined only by their beginnings. The same emotions that bring two people together can sometimes become the source of conflict when expectations, fears, and insecurities begin to appear. As Travis and Jodi spent more time together, differences between them became clearer. Travis had a very specific vision for his future. He wanted a relationship that aligned with his beliefs. He wanted commitment. He wanted a partner who shared his values. Jodi, however, appeared to become increasingly emotionally attached to him. Her connection with Travis became more than simply a romantic relationship. For her, Travis seemed to represent stability, belonging, and purpose. This difference in emotional expectations would become one of the most important elements of the story. Because while Travis began questioning whether their relationship could continue, Jodi appeared to struggle with the possibility of losing him. Their relationship entered a complicated stage. They broke up. But they did not truly separate. The emotional connection remained. They continued communicating. They continued meeting. They continued returning to each other despite the problems that had pushed them apart. To outsiders, it was confusing. If two people knew they were not right for each other, why did they keep coming back? The answer may have been that neither of them had fully accepted the ending. Travis wanted distance, but he also maintained contact. Jodi wanted closeness, but she could not control the direction Travis's life was moving. The result was a relationship trapped between two realities. They were no longer officially together. But they were not emotionally free from each other either. During this period, Travis began building a life that did not revolve around Jodi. He continued his career. He continued spending time with friends. He continued looking toward the future. And that future increasingly appeared to exist without her. For Jodi, that reality seemed increasingly difficult to accept. People close to Travis later described moments when they felt uncomfortable with Jodi's behavior. They believed she appeared overly involved in his personal life even after their romantic relationship had ended. They noticed that she continued seeking his attention. They noticed that she remained present even when Travis attempted to move forward. At the time, these moments may have seemed like relationship problems. Arguments. Misunderstandings. Emotional struggles. Nobody could know that they would later be examined as possible warning signs before a tragedy. Because before every major crime, there is often a period when the people involved are still living ordinary lives. There are conversations. There are decisions. There are moments that seem insignificant. Only afterward, when people look back, do those moments appear different. By 2008, Travis and Jodi's relationship had become increasingly complicated. The affection that once brought them together had become mixed with tension, disappointment, and unresolved emotions. Yet neither of them could completely walk away. This emotional conflict created the environment in which the final chapter of Travis Alexander's life would unfold. On the outside, Travis continued to appear successful and optimistic. He had friends who cared about him. He had goals he wanted to achieve. He had plans for the future. But beneath the surface, a storm was developing. A storm created by a relationship that had never truly ended. A storm that would eventually reach the quiet streets of Mesa, Arizona. Mesa was not a place most people would associate with a shocking murder investigation. It was a growing city surrounded by desert landscapes, where families lived ordinary lives and neighbors often knew each other by familiar routines. The Arizona heat shaped daily life there. The dry air. The endless sunlight. The quiet evenings when the streets became still. In this environment, Travis had created his home. A place where he worked, rested, welcomed friends, and imagined his future. It was supposed to be a place of safety. A place where his dreams continued. But on June 4, 2008, everything changed. The home that represented his independence and success would become the center of a mystery that would capture national attention. And as investigators later discovered, the answer to what happened inside that house was not hidden with a stranger. It was connected to someone Travis had once welcomed into his life. Someone who knew his habits. Someone who knew his personality. Someone who had once been close enough to know his hopes and fears. The woman at the center of the investigation was Jodi Arias. And before the world knew her name, she was simply the person Travis had once loved. A relationship that began with possibility was moving toward a devastating conclusion. And the final days before the murder would reveal just how far their connection had fallen from the happiness it once appeared to represent, long before his name appeared in newspapers, before television cameras surrounded a courtroom in Arizona, and before millions of strangers learned the details of his final moments. Travis Victor Alexander was simply a man trying to build a meaningful life. The public would eventually know him because of how he died. But those who loved him wanted people to remember something different. They wanted people to remember how he lived. They wanted the world to see Travis not as a victim in a murder case, but as a person with dreams, struggles, victories, flaws, friendships, and hopes for the future. Because behind every headline about a crime, there is always a human story that existed before the tragedy. And Travis Alexander's story was one of transformation. He was born on July 28, 1977, in California. His early life was not easy. Travis grew up facing challenges that could have shaped him in a negative way. His childhood included instability and difficult family circumstances. For many people, experiences like those can leave lasting wounds, creating feelings of anger, hopelessness, or resentment. But Travis chose another path. Instead of allowing his past to control him, he used it as motivation. He wanted to become different. He wanted to create the kind of life he had always wished for. Those who knew Travis often said that one of the most remarkable things about him was his ability to reinvent himself. He was not born into a life of privilege. He did not simply inherit success. He worked for it. Every achievement represented effort. Every step forward represented determination. As he grew older, Travis developed a strong desire to improve himself. He became interested in personal development, communication, and the idea that people could change their circumstances through discipline and dedication. That mindset became a major part of his identity. He was the type of person who believed tomorrow could always be better than today. His friends remembered him as someone who encouraged others. If someone was struggling, Travis was often the person who offered advice. If someone doubted themselves, he was the person who reminded them of their potential. He had a natural ability to make people feel important. That ability helped him professionally as well. Travis built a successful career in sales, a field where personality and trust were essential. He was not only selling products or services. He was selling confidence, ideas, and relationships. He understood people. He knew how to communicate. He knew how to motivate. For Travis, success was not only about earning money. It was also about proving that someone could rise above difficult beginnings. He wanted his story to mean something. Outside of work, Travis was deeply connected to his religious community. His faith influenced the way he viewed life, relationships, and responsibility. Friends described him as someone who took his beliefs seriously. He wanted his actions to match his values. He was not perfect, but he constantly tried to become a better version of himself. He dreamed of marriage. He dreamed of having children. He dreamed of creating a family environment that was stable and loving. The idea of building something lasting was important to him. And that dream was one of the reasons his relationship with Jodi Arias became so significant. When Travis met Jodi in 2006, he was at a stage in life where he was looking for connection. He was successful, but success alone was not enough. He wanted companionship. He wanted someone who understood him. He wanted someone who could walk beside him toward the future he imagined. At first, Jodi seemed like someone who brought excitement and emotional energy into his life. She was creative. She was interested in him. She admired his confidence and achievements. Their early relationship moved quickly. They spent time together. They shared personal conversations. They created memories that, at the time, seemed meaningful. For Travis, the relationship may have represented another possibility. Another chance to find the person he would eventually build a life with. But over time, reality became more complicated. Travis began seeing differences between them. Their expectations were not the same. Their beliefs about relationships and the future did not always align. The qualities that initially attracted them to each other eventually became sources of tension. The relationship ended romantically in 2007. But Travis was not someone who simply erased people from his life. Even after the breakup, he continued communicating with Jodi. Like many complicated relationships, theirs existed in a confusing space. They were no longer a traditional couple. But they were not complete strangers. There were still emotional connections. There were still conversations. There were still moments when they returned to each other. However, Travis began moving toward a different future. He wanted stability. He wanted a relationship that matched his long-term goals. He wanted to find someone who shared his vision. Those close to him noticed that he was becoming more focused on that future. He continued spending time with friends. He continued working. He continued planning. To many people around him, Travis seemed to be entering one of the most promising periods of his life. He was only 30 years old. He had built a career. He had strong friendships. He had a community that supported him. He had dreams that were still waiting to be achieved. The tragedy was that so many of those dreams remained unfinished. One of the most painful aspects of the case is that Travis was not someone whose life appeared to be falling apart. He was not someone who had disappeared from society. He was not someone living without direction. He was a person who was actively building. He was planning. He was hoping. And that is what made his death so shocking to those who knew him. Friends who later spoke about Travis often struggled with the same question. How could someone so full of life be gone so suddenly? How could a person who spent so much time helping others become the victim of such violence? The answer would take years to fully uncover. But before investigators focused on evidence, before lawyers debated motives, and before the courtroom became a national stage, there was a simple truth. Travis Alexander mattered to people. He was a friend who made people laugh. He was a colleague who inspired others. He was a son who carried the weight of his past while trying to create a better future. He was a man who believed that people could change. That belief shaped his entire life. Perhaps that is why his story continues to attract attention years later. Because the case is not only about the circumstances of his death. It is also about the life that existed before it. The conversations that will never happen again. The goals that were never completed. The memories that remain with those who loved him. In the days before June 4, 2008, Travis was still living the life he had worked so hard to create. He woke up. He went to work. He talked with friends. He made plans. He believed there would be another day. Another opportunity. Another chance to become better. He did not know that someone connected to his past was about to enter his home. He did not know that the relationship he had tried to leave behind would become the focus of a criminal investigation. He did not know that his name would become attached to one of the most controversial murder trials in American history. But Travis Alexander's story does not begin with violence. It begins with ambition. It begins with resilience. It begins with a young man who refused to let his past determine his future. And before the world knew him as the victim of a shocking crime, Travis Alexander was simply Travis. A man who laughed loudly. A man who dreamed deeply. A man who believed life still had so much more to offer. A man whose future was taken away far too soon. In the days leading up to June 4, 2008, nothing about Travis Alexander's life suggested that he was approaching the final hours of his existence. To everyone around him, Travis was still moving forward. He was making plans. He was thinking about his career. He was maintaining friendships. He was preparing for the opportunities that he believed were waiting ahead. His life followed the rhythm of an ordinary routine. The kind of routine most people rarely appreciate until it disappears forever. The conversations. The small decisions. The simple moments that seem meaningless at the time. For Travis, those moments represented the life he had worked so hard to build. But behind that ordinary appearance, there was another story unfolding. A story involving a relationship that had never truly ended. A relationship filled with affection, conflict, attraction, disappointment, and unresolved emotions. And on June 4, 2008, that relationship would reach a devastating conclusion. The day began like any other day in Mesa, Arizona. The desert sun rose over the city, bringing another warm morning to a place where heat was a constant part of life. The streets slowly filled with movement as people went to work, ran errands, and continued with their daily routines. Inside his home, Travis Alexander was preparing for the day ahead. There was no sign that anything unusual was about to happen. No warning. No obvious indication that danger was approaching. But investigators would later reconstruct the events of that day and discover that someone from Travis's past had entered his home. That person was Jodi Arias. At that point, Travis and Jodi's relationship had already gone through months of emotional uncertainty. They were no longer officially together. But they still maintained contact. They still shared moments of intimacy. They still had a connection that neither of them seemed able to completely break. To outsiders, their relationship was difficult to understand. How could two people who had ended their romance continue returning to each other? How could someone move on while still keeping the door open to the past? These questions became central after Travis's death because investigators believed the emotional tension between them played an important role in what happened inside his home. One of the most significant issues was Travis's upcoming trip to Mexico. Travel plans had changed. Originally, Jodi had been expected to accompany him. But eventually, Travis decided to make different arrangements. He planned to travel with another woman, Mimi Hall. For investigators, this change became an important detail. They believed it may have intensified feelings of jealousy and rejection within Jodi. The idea that Travis was moving forward without her appeared to represent something she struggled to accept. But on the morning of June 4th, nobody knew what was happening beneath the surface. Nobody knew that the final chapter of Travis's life was beginning. According to the investigation, Jodi traveled to Mesa and arrived at Travis's home. Her presence there would later become one of the most important facts in the case. At first, there was no immediate indication that something terrible was about to happen. The two people inside the home had known each other for years. They had shared private conversations. They had shared personal moments. Travis had once trusted her. That trust would become one of the most heartbreaking elements of the entire case. Because the person investigators believed entered his home was not a stranger. It was someone who had once been welcomed into his life. Someone who knew his personality. Someone who knew his routines. Someone who had once been close enough to understand what mattered to him. The exact sequence of events inside the house would later become a subject of intense debate during the trial. Investigators pieced together evidence from photographs, forensic findings, digital records, and witness statements. One of the most important pieces of evidence came from a digital camera. The camera contained photographs that appeared to capture moments from Travis's final day. Some images had been deleted, but forensic experts were able to recover them. The recovered photographs showed Travis and Jodi together shortly before his death. They revealed that the two had been inside the home at a time close to when investigators believed the attack occurred. The camera became a silent witness. It preserved fragments of the final hours of Travis's life. Moments that would later be examined repeatedly in a courtroom. Moments that transformed a personal tragedy into a national story. But the photographs did not reveal everything. They did not show what happened after. They did not show the moment when the relationship between Travis and Jodi changed from complicated to catastrophic. They did not show the thoughts, emotions, or decisions that led to violence. They only showed the final pieces of a timeline. After those images were taken, something terrible happened. Travis Alexander was attacked inside his own home. Investigators determined that the violence was extreme. The attack involved multiple forms of injury, including numerous stab wounds, a fatal gunshot wound, and a severe wound to his neck. The level of violence immediately suggested to investigators that this was not a random act. This was personal. The scene told a story of anger and intensity. The person responsible had not simply entered a home and committed a crime before leaving. The attack represented a powerful emotional confrontation. A relationship had collapsed. A life had ended. And the person who had once been connected to Travis romantically was now at the center of a murder investigation. But on that day, the world outside continued as normal. Neighbors continued their routines. People drove through the streets of Mesa. Businesses opened. Phones rang. People laughed. Life continued. Only inside one house, everything had changed. The following days would bring confusion, concern, and eventually, unimaginable grief. Because Travis was not someone who simply disappeared without people noticing. He was responsible. He was social. He was someone who stayed connected with those around him. When he stopped responding, people immediately sensed that something was wrong. At first, friends hoped for a harmless explanation. Maybe Travis was busy. Maybe he needed some time. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. But as hours passed, concern became fear. The man who was usually dependable had become unreachable. And soon, friends would make a decision that would reveal one of the most shocking crime scenes in Arizona's history. They would go to Travis's home. They would open the door. And they would discover the horrifying reality that had been hidden inside. The discovery would begin a massive investigation. An investigation that would uncover contradictions, hidden emotions, and a series of changing stories. An investigation that would transform Jodi Arias from a former girlfriend into one of the most controversial criminal defendants in America. But before the investigation began, before the courtroom battles, and before the public formed opinions about what happened, there was one undeniable fact. Travis Alexander was gone. A man who had spent his life trying to create something meaningful had lost everything inside the place where he should have felt safest. His home. His personal space. The place where he had imagined building his future. The final hours of Travis Alexander's life would become the center of a mystery that would last for years. A mystery filled with questions. Why did someone he trusted turn against him? What happened during those final moments? And how did a relationship that began with attraction and affection end in such devastating violence? The answers would slowly emerge. But first, investigators had to enter the home where Travis's life had ended. And inside those walls waited the evidence that would reveal the truth. For 5 days, the world outside Travis Alexander's home continued without knowing what had happened behind his front door. The neighborhood remained quiet. The streets of Mesa, Arizona, carried on with their normal rhythm. Neighbors went to work. Cars moved through the streets. Families followed their daily routines. But inside the home where Travis had lived, a terrible secret remained hidden. A man who was known for his energy, his conversations, and his constant presence had suddenly disappeared. And the silence surrounding his absence became impossible to ignore. Travis Alexander was not someone who simply vanished. He had responsibilities. He had commitments. He had people who expected to hear from him. His friends knew his personality well. They knew he was organized. They knew he cared about his reputation and his relationships. If Travis said he would be somewhere, he usually was there. That was why his absence felt unusual. At first, people tried to explain it logically. Maybe his phone had stopped working. Maybe he had become busy. Maybe something unexpected had happened. But as the days passed, those explanations became harder to believe. The people closest to Travis began feeling a growing sense of fear. Something was wrong. By June 9, 2008, concern had reached a point where several friends decided they needed to check on him. They were not expecting to find a crime scene. They were expecting to find Travis alive. They were expecting him to open the door and explain everything. They were expecting a normal answer to an unusual situation. Instead, they were about to discover the horrifying truth. When they arrived at Travis's home in Mesa, the first signs of trouble were not immediately obvious. The house looked like any other home in the neighborhood. Nothing about the outside suggested that a violent crime had occurred inside. That was part of what made the discovery so disturbing. A place that appeared completely ordinary from the outside was hiding an unimaginable reality. Friends entered the home and began looking for Travis. At first, they searched through the rooms, calling his name, hoping he would answer. Then they reached the bathroom. And everything changed. Inside, they found Travis Alexander. The person they had come to rescue was already gone. The shock of that moment would stay with them forever. The man they knew as a friend, someone full of energy and plans for the future, had been killed in a place that was supposed to represent safety. The scene immediately indicated that this was not an accident. It was not a disappearance. It was a violent crime. Law enforcement was called, and soon the quiet neighborhood became the center of an intense investigation. Detectives arrived at the home knowing they had to carefully reconstruct what happened. Every detail mattered. Every object could provide information. Every mark, every photograph, every piece of evidence could help explain the final moments of Travis Alexander's life. The crime scene revealed a level of violence that immediately captured investigators' attention. Travis had suffered multiple injuries. He had been stabbed numerous times. He had suffered a gunshot wound. He had also sustained a severe injury to his neck. The attack was brutal and personal. For investigators, the nature of the injuries suggested something beyond a simple burglary or random confrontation. The violence appeared connected to emotion. Anger. Rage. A personal conflict. The person responsible had not simply entered the home and committed a crime before leaving. The scene suggested a confrontation between people who knew each other. Someone had been close enough to Travis to gain access to his private world. Someone had been close enough to be trusted. The question was no longer only, who killed Travis Alexander? The question became, who in his life had a reason to hurt him? Investigators began examining Travis's relationships. They looked at his friends, his professional connections, his personal life. And very quickly, one name began appearing repeatedly. Jodi Arias. The relationship between Travis and Jodi immediately became a major focus. Detectives learned that the two had a complicated romantic history. They had dated. They had broken up. They had continued communicating. They had remained connected even after the relationship officially ended. To investigators, that complicated history created an important question. Was this a relationship that had ended peacefully? Or was it a relationship filled with unresolved emotions? As detectives began collecting evidence, one item became especially important. A digital camera. In many criminal investigations, technology becomes a silent witness. A phone record. A message. A photograph. A digital file. These things can preserve moments that people never expected would later become evidence. In Travis's case, the camera became one of the most significant pieces of the investigation. Experts discovered that photographs had been deleted. But deleted does not always mean gone forever. Through forensic recovery methods, investigators were able to retrieve images from the camera's memory. Those photographs revealed something crucial. Travis and Jodi had been together inside the home shortly before his death. The images challenged any possibility that Jodi had not been there. They placed her near the center of the timeline. The camera had captured moments from the final hours of Travis's life. Moments that seemed ordinary at first. But after the discovery of his body, those same images carried a completely different meaning. They became fragments of a story that ended in tragedy. Investigators also found additional evidence connecting Jodi to the crime scene. A bloody handprint discovered inside the home became another important piece of evidence. Testing later indicated the presence of DNA connected to both Travis and Jodi. The investigation was quickly narrowing. But finding evidence was only one part of the process. Investigators still needed to understand motive. Why would someone who once had a relationship with Travis do something so violent? What happened between the moment they were together and the moment Travis was killed? What emotions were present during those final minutes? Those questions would become the foundation of the case. As detectives continued investigating, they began examining Jodi's behavior after the murder. And what they discovered would make the case even more complicated. Because Jodi Arias did not simply provide one explanation. Her story changed. Again and again. At first, she claimed she had not been in Mesa on the day Travis died. Then, as evidence began contradicting that claim, a different version emerged. She suggested that Travis had been attacked by unknown intruders and that she had somehow become involved. Later, facing even stronger evidence, she admitted she had been there. But she insisted the killing happened because she was defending herself. Each explanation created new questions. Each change made investigators more suspicious. To them, the problem was not only what Jody said. It was how often the story changed. The truth usually becomes clearer as evidence appears. But in this case, every new statement seemed to create another mystery. The investigation into Travis Alexander's death was becoming a battle between evidence and explanation. Between what investigators believed happened and what Jody claimed happened. And at the center of everything was a young man whose life had been taken away. A man whose final moments were now being reconstructed piece by piece. The home in Mesa had provided investigators with their first answers. But it had also created even more questions. The crime scene revealed violence. The evidence pointed toward someone close. The timeline placed Jodi Arias near the center. But the most important question remained unanswered. What exactly happened inside that house on June 4, 2008? To discover that truth, investigators would have to follow the trail left behind. A trail of photographs. A trail of DNA. A trail of changing stories. And a trail that would eventually lead to one of the most closely watched murder trials in America. When investigators first entered Travis Alexander's home, they were faced with a scene that seemed to tell a clear story. A man had been killed. The attack had been violent. The person responsible appeared to have a connection to the victim. But solving a murder is not only about discovering what happened. It is about proving why it happened. It requires investigators to move carefully through a maze of possibilities, separating facts from assumptions and evidence from emotions. In the days following Travis Alexander's death, detectives began rebuilding his final hours. They examined his home. They analyzed physical evidence. They interviewed the people closest to him. And slowly, a picture began forming of the complicated relationship that had surrounded Travis before his death. The investigation quickly moved toward one central question. Who was the last person known to be with Travis? The answer was Jodi Arias. At first, Jodi was not immediately treated as a suspect in the public eye. She was someone connected to Travis. Someone who had once been romantically involved with him. Someone who could potentially provide information. But as detectives examined the timeline, her position in the investigation changed. The more they learned, the more questions appeared. Jodi Arias had told investigators that she was not in Mesa on June 4, 2008. She claimed she had not seen Travis that day. At first glance, that statement created distance between her and the crime. But investigators began comparing her words with the evidence they were finding. The digital camera told a different story. The recovered photographs placed Jodi inside Travis's home. They showed that the two had been together shortly before the murder. The evidence contradicted her initial statement. And when investigators confronted her with those contradictions, the story began to change. This became one of the most important patterns of the entire case. The facts were moving in one direction. Jodi's explanations were moving in another. Investigators were not only looking for physical evidence. They were also looking at behavior. They were asking why someone would deny being at a location if there was nothing to hide. They were asking why the truth seemed to emerge only after evidence made denial impossible. For detectives, inconsistencies can be as important as fingerprints. A changing story does not automatically prove guilt, but it can create doubt about a person's credibility. And in the Travis Alexander investigation, credibility would become one of the biggest battles. As detectives continued examining the evidence, they discovered more details about the relationship between Travis and Jodi. Friends and acquaintances described a relationship that had become increasingly complicated. They explained that Travis had attempted to move forward with his life. He had continued meeting other people. He had continued making plans. He had continued pursuing the future he wanted. But Jodi remained connected to him. The relationship existed in an uncertain space. They were no longer a traditional couple. Yet they continued communicating. They continued seeing each other. They continued returning to a connection that had already caused emotional conflict. Investigators began exploring whether jealousy or rejection could have played a role. They looked at the timing of events. They examined Travis's plans. They considered how Jodi might have reacted to the idea that Travis was moving on. One important detail was Travis's upcoming trip to Mexico. The trip represented more than just travel. It represented change. A new chapter. A future that appeared to be moving further away from Jodi. Investigators believed this may have created intense emotions. They believed that the possibility of permanently losing Travis's attention could have been a powerful trigger. But proving motive would require more than understanding emotions. It required evidence. And investigators continued gathering pieces of the puzzle. They examined phone records. They reviewed digital information. They studied messages exchanged between Travis and Jodi. Those messages revealed a relationship filled with complicated emotions. There were moments of affection. There were moments of conflict. There were moments where the two appeared unable to completely separate. The communication between them became another window into the relationship that existed before the murder. To investigators, it showed a connection that had become unstable. A relationship where one person appeared to be trying to move forward while the other struggled to accept that separation. But Jodi's defense would later present a very different interpretation. They would argue that the relationship was misunderstood. They would argue that Jodi was not a person driven by obsession or anger. They would argue that she was someone caught in a frightening situation. This conflict between two completely different versions of events would eventually become the heart of the courtroom battle. But before the trial, investigators still had to complete their work. They had to examine every possible explanation. They had to determine whether another person could have been responsible. They had to rule out alternative theories. In the early stages of any major murder investigation, detectives must consider every possibility. Was this a burglary? Was this a random attack? Was there another person involved? But as evidence accumulated, investigators became increasingly focused on Jodi Arias. The crime scene suggested a personal connection. The digital evidence placed her with Travis. The changing statements created suspicion. And forensic evidence linked her to the location. The investigation was no longer simply about discovering who had been in Travis's home. It was about understanding what happened between two people who once claimed to care about each other. Meanwhile, Jodi continued to defend herself publicly. She insisted that she was innocent. She continued providing explanations for what happened. But each explanation created new challenges. The first version of events placed her far away from the crime. The second suggested that unknown attackers were responsible. The third admitted she had been there but claimed she acted in self-defense. For investigators, these changes were difficult to ignore. A person telling the truth should not need to completely rebuild the story multiple times. But Jodi's supporters viewed the situation differently. They argued that trauma could affect memory. They argued that fear could influence how someone described events. The debate over Jodi's credibility began long before the trial. The public became divided. Some people believed she was manipulating the investigation. Others believed there was more to the story. The case began attracting attention because it contained all the elements that captured public fascination. A complicated relationship. A shocking murder. A suspect with changing stories. And a victim whose life had been suddenly taken away. But behind the media attention, detectives continued working. They were not looking for entertainment. They were looking for answers. They were trying to reconstruct a single day that had ended with a man dead inside his own home. Every photograph mattered. Every message mattered. Every detail mattered. Because somewhere inside those details was the truth. The investigation eventually reached a turning point. The evidence had created a clear path toward one conclusion. Jodi Arias was no longer simply a former girlfriend. She was the person investigators believed was responsible for the death of Travis Alexander. But proving that belief would require another battle. A battle that would take place in a courtroom. A battle where every piece of evidence would be questioned. Every statement would be examined. And where Jodi Arias herself would have to face the world. The investigation had uncovered the questions. Now the justice system would search for the answers. And the next chapter would reveal how a murder case became one of the most watched trials in modern American history. In a murder investigation, there are moments when the entire direction of a case changes. A single discovery. A single piece of evidence. A single contradiction that causes investigators to look at everything differently. For the case of Travis Alexander, that moment came through a combination of technology, forensic science, and the unraveling of a story that could no longer survive against the evidence. At the beginning of the investigation, detectives knew they had a violent crime. They knew Travis had been killed inside his own home. They knew the attack was personal. But knowing someone was responsible and proving who that person was were two very different challenges. The investigators needed a clear path. They needed evidence that could connect a suspect to the crime beyond reasonable doubt. And slowly, that path began forming around Jodi Arias. One of the most important breakthroughs came from something many people consider ordinary today. A camera. A small digital device that had captured moments nobody knew would later become part of a murder investigation. The camera belonged to Travis. Inside it were photographs that revealed pieces of the final day of his life. At first, the images seemed like nothing more than private memories. Two people together. A normal interaction between people who knew each other. But after Travis was found dead, those images became something much more significant. They became a timeline. They became evidence. They became a silent record of what happened before the violence. Investigators discovered that some photographs had been deleted. But digital information often leaves behind traces. Even when someone attempts to remove files, remnants can sometimes remain hidden within the device's memory. Through forensic recovery, investigators were able to restore images that had disappeared. Those recovered photographs placed Jodi Arias inside Travis's home shortly before his death. This discovery directly challenged her original claim that she had not been there. The investigation changed immediately. Jodi was no longer simply someone connected to the victim. She became the central focus. But the photographs were only one piece of the puzzle. Investigators continued examining the physical evidence left behind at the crime scene. The home itself told a story. It showed signs of a violent confrontation. The injuries suffered by Travis suggested an attack fueled by intense emotion. The scene did not appear random. It appeared deeply personal. The person responsible seemed to know Travis. They had access to his private space. They were close enough to him to be inside his home. And they had remained there long enough for the attack to unfold. For detectives, the question became not whether Jodi had been present. The evidence increasingly suggested that she had. The question became, what happened between Travis and Jodi during those final moments? And why? As investigators searched for answers, they began analyzing Jodi's statements more closely. Her changing explanations became one of the strongest elements of the prosecution's future case. At first, Jodi denied being in Mesa. She said she had not visited Travis on the day he died. But when evidence contradicted that statement, the explanation changed. She then claimed that Travis had been attacked by unknown intruders. She portrayed herself as someone who had also been caught in a dangerous situation. But again, investigators found problems with the story. The evidence did not support the idea of a random attack. There were no convincing signs that strangers had entered the home and committed the murder. The focus returned to Jodi. Eventually, she admitted that she had been at Travis's home. But the explanation changed once more. This time, she claimed the killing happened because she was defending herself. According to her version, Travis had become violent and she feared for her life. She presented herself not as an attacker, but as someone who had been forced into an impossible situation. This claim would become the foundation of her defense years later. But investigators viewed the situation differently. They questioned whether the level of violence was consistent with self-defense. They questioned why the story had changed so many times. They questioned why the evidence appeared to contradict so many parts of her account. For them, the pattern suggested something else. They believed the murder was planned. They believed the relationship between Travis and Jodi had reached a breaking point. And they believed jealousy and emotional control were possible motivations. Another important development came from examining the events before the murder. Investigators looked closely at Jodi's actions leading up to June 4, 2008. They examined her movements. They examined her communications. They examined her connection to Travis. The more they looked, the more they believed the meeting between Travis and Jodi was not accidental. It was not simply two former partners having a final conversation. It was a moment that had been building for some time. The upcoming Mexico trip became especially important. Travis was moving forward. He was making plans that did not include Jodi. He was creating distance. And investigators believed that possibility may have represented a final emotional breaking point. The idea that someone they loved could leave forever can create powerful emotions in unstable relationships. Feelings of rejection. Feelings of anger. Feelings of desperation. But emotions alone do not explain murder. Investigators needed to connect emotion with action. And they believed the evidence did that. The forensic findings. The photographs. The statements. The timeline. All of these pieces began forming a single picture. A picture where Travis Alexander's death was not the result of a random encounter. It was the end of a relationship that had become dangerously complicated. As the investigation moved forward, Jodi Arias became increasingly aware that the evidence surrounding her was becoming impossible to ignore. The story she had created was collapsing under the weight of facts. The camera contradicted her first statement. The physical evidence contradicted her later explanations. And the timeline continued pointing back to the same place. Travis's home. The investigation that began with uncertainty was now moving toward a clear conclusion. But reaching that conclusion required more than evidence. It required a legal battle. Because the justice system does not decide guilt based only on suspicion. It requires proof. It requires arguments. It requires a courtroom where every detail can be challenged. And that courtroom battle would become one of the most dramatic and widely followed trials in America. Before that happened, however, another important chapter unfolded. The arrest of Jodi Arias. The moment when investigators officially moved from searching for answers to accusing someone of murder. On July 9, 2008, Jodi Arias was arrested in connection with the killing of Travis Alexander. The woman who once described Travis as someone important in her life was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life behind bars. The case had reached a turning point. The investigation was no longer a mystery. The questions had become accusations. And the accusations would soon be tested in court. The world would hear two completely different stories. One story describing a calculated act of violence driven by obsession and anger. Another story describing a desperate act of survival. Only one version could become the official truth. And the courtroom would decide which one. When Jodi Arias entered the courtroom in 2013, the case that had begun as a private tragedy inside a quiet Arizona home had become a national obsession. For years, investigators, attorneys, and the public had searched for answers surrounding the death of Travis Alexander. Now, those answers would be debated under the intense pressure of a courtroom. Every photograph would be examined. Every message would be analyzed. Every statement would be questioned. And at the center of it all was one question. Was Jodi Arias a woman who had acted in desperation to save herself, or was she responsible for a deliberate and violent murder? The trial became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in America. Part of the reason was the shocking nature of the crime. A young man with a promising future had been killed inside his own home. But the public fascination also came from the complexity of the relationship between Travis and Jodi. This was not a case involving two strangers. It was a story of two people who had once been emotionally connected. Two people who had shared private moments. Two people whose relationship had transformed from attraction into something far more complicated. The courtroom became the place where those hidden details would be exposed. The prosecution's case was built around a simple argument. They believed Jodi Arias had killed Travis Alexander because she could not accept losing him. They argued that the relationship had ended, but Jodi remained emotionally attached. They believed she became increasingly jealous as Travis moved forward with his life. And they argued that the violence of the attack demonstrated anger, control, and revenge. The prosecution presented Travis as a man who had been trying to move on. They described him as someone focused on his career, his friendships, and his future. They argued that his decision to travel to Mexico without Jodi represented a moment when she realized she was losing her connection to him. According to prosecutors, the murder was not an accident. It was not a sudden act of fear. It was a decision. A deliberate act committed after emotions reached a breaking point. But the defense presented a completely different story. They argued that Jodi Arias was not a cold-blooded killer. They argued that she was a woman who had experienced fear and violence. They claimed that Travis had become aggressive and that Jodi had acted in self-defense. The defense wanted the jury to look beyond the brutality of the crime scene and examine the relationship itself. They argued that the dynamic between Travis and Jodi was more complicated than prosecutors suggested. They suggested that there were details about their private interactions that the public did not understand. The trial became a battle between two versions of reality. One side described obsession. The other described survival. And the jury had to determine which story was supported by the evidence. One of the most important moments of the trial involved Jodi Arias herself. Unlike many defendants who avoid testifying, Jodi chose to take the witness stand. For 18 days, she answered questions from attorneys. Her testimony became one of the most discussed aspects of the entire trial. Under questioning, Jodi described her relationship with Travis. She spoke about their connection. She spoke about their conflicts. She spoke about the events leading up to June 4, 2008. She maintained that she had not planned to kill Travis. She insisted that the situation had escalated and that she had acted because she feared for her life. But prosecutors focused heavily on the changes in her story. They questioned why she had initially denied being at Travis's home. They questioned why she later blamed unknown attackers. They questioned why the explanation changed again when evidence connected her directly to the crime. The prosecution argued that the changing stories were not the result of trauma. They argued they were attempts to avoid responsibility. During cross-examination, prosecutors repeatedly returned to the same issue. If Jodi was telling the truth, why did the truth keep changing? The courtroom became a place where every detail of Jodi's statements was examined. Her memory. Her emotions. Her behavior after the murder. Her explanations. Nothing was ignored. The prosecution also presented evidence from the crime scene. They showed the jury the photographs recovered from the camera. They presented forensic evidence. They discussed the timeline of events. Piece by piece, they attempted to reconstruct what happened inside Travis's home. For the prosecution, the evidence created a clear picture. They argued that Jodi had entered Travis's life, struggled to accept losing him, and ultimately destroyed the future he was trying to build. But the defense continued challenging that interpretation. They argued that the prosecution was creating a story based on assumptions. They argued that relationships are complicated and that emotional behavior alone does not prove murder. The jury was forced to consider every possibility. The trial lasted for months. The public followed every development. News organizations covered the proceedings daily. People across America debated the case. Some saw Jodi as manipulative. Others believed there were unanswered questions. The intense media attention turned the trial into a national conversation about relationships, obsession, manipulation, and violence. But beneath the headlines was a grieving family. For Travis's loved ones, the trial was not entertainment. It was the painful process of revisiting the loss of someone they cared about. Every photograph shown in court represented a memory. Every piece of evidence represented the final moments of Travis's life. While millions of people watched the case unfold, those closest to Travis were forced to experience the tragedy again and again. They listened as strangers debated the details of his death. They heard arguments about his personality. They heard descriptions of his final moments. And through it all, they continued remembering the person Travis had been before the crime. A friend. A brother. A son. A person with dreams that would never be completed. As the trial approached its conclusion, the jury faced an enormous responsibility. They had to decide whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. They had to decide whether Jodi Arias was responsible for Travis Alexander's death. After weeks of testimony and hours of deliberation, the decision finally arrived. On May 8, 2013, the jury returned with its verdict. Jodi Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom reacted with emotion as the decision was announced. For Travis's family and supporters, it represented a moment of justice. For Jodi Arias, it marked the beginning of the next phase of the legal battle. But the case was not over. A guilty verdict answered one question. It did not answer every question. The next stage would determine the punishment. And prosecutors would seek the most severe penalty available. The possibility of a death sentence now entered the courtroom. The same case that had captured America's attention was about to enter another dramatic chapter. A chapter focused not on what happened inside Travis Alexander's home, but on what should happen to the person convicted of taking his life. The trial had revealed the evidence. The jury had made its decision. But the final judgment had not yet been delivered. And the world was still waiting to learn what punishment Jodi Arias would receive. The guilty verdict had answered one of the biggest questions surrounding the case. After years of investigation, countless hours of testimony, and months of courtroom battles, a jury had reached its conclusion. Jodi Arias was responsible for the murder of Travis Alexander. But for Travis's family, friends, and everyone who had followed the case, the verdict was not the end. A conviction could not bring Travis back. A courtroom decision could not restore the future he had planned. It could not return the conversations that would never happen again. It could not fill the empty spaces left behind in the lives of the people who loved him. The next question was what justice would look like. And that question would lead to another emotional and controversial chapter of the case. The sentencing phase. After being found guilty of first-degree murder, Jodi Arias faced the possibility of the most severe punishment available under Arizona law, the death penalty. Prosecutors argued that the circumstances of the crime justified the ultimate punishment. They pointed to the brutality of the attack. They argued that the violence demonstrated a level of planning and cruelty that deserved the harshest sentence. To them, Travis Alexander had not simply lost his life. He had been the victim of an intentional and devastating act of violence committed by someone he once trusted. The prosecution emphasized that Travis had been attacked inside his own home. A place where he should have felt protected. A place where he should have been safe. Instead, it became the location of his final moments. For Travis's family, the sentencing hearing was another painful reminder of what had been taken away. They once again had to speak about the person they lost. They had to describe the impact of his absence. They had to explain how one violent act had changed countless lives forever. Behind the legal arguments and media coverage was a family still trying to understand how someone so full of energy and possibility could suddenly be gone. They remembered Travis before the crime. They remembered his laughter. His personality. His ambition. His desire to help people. Those memories became especially important because the trial had often focused on the final moments of his life. But Travis Alexander was more than the way he died. He was a person who had spent years building relationships and creating memories. The sentencing phase forced everyone involved to confront the difference between justice and revenge. For many victims' families, justice is not about celebration. It is about accountability. It is about recognizing the value of the life that was lost. It is about ensuring that the person responsible is held responsible. The defense, however, continued fighting against the death penalty. They argued that Jodi Arias should not receive the ultimate punishment. They presented arguments about her background, her personality, and the circumstances surrounding the crime. They asked the court to consider a sentence that would allow her to remain alive but imprisoned. The sentencing process became another battle between two opposing views. The prosecution focused on the severity of the crime. The defense focused on the person behind the conviction. The jury faced the difficult responsibility of deciding whether the death penalty was appropriate. But after the first sentencing phase, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision. The result was a mistrial in the penalty phase. This meant that the question of punishment would continue. Another jury would later be asked to determine whether Jodi Arias should be sentenced to death. The case remained in the spotlight. People across the country continued following every development. Some believed the crime was so severe that only the death penalty could represent justice. Others questioned whether any case, regardless of the circumstances, should end with execution. The debate surrounding the case expanded beyond Travis and Jodi. It became a national conversation about punishment, responsibility, and the purpose of the justice system. Eventually, the decision was made. Jodi Arias would not receive the death penalty. Instead, she was sentenced to life in prison. For some, the sentence represented accountability. For others, it was not enough. There were people who believed that the severity of the crime demanded a harsher punishment. But legally, the case had reached its conclusion. Jodi Arias would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The courtroom doors eventually closed. The cameras moved away. The headlines faded. But the impact of Travis Alexander's death remained. For those who loved him, there was no final verdict that could erase the pain. There was only the process of learning how to live with the loss. The years after the trial brought reflection on what the case represented. Many experts and observers examined the relationship between Travis and Jodi as an example of how emotional dependence and control can create dangerous situations. The case became widely discussed in conversations about unhealthy relationships. Not every difficult relationship leads to violence. Most do not. But the tragedy of Travis Alexander's death caused many people to look more closely at warning signs that can appear when a relationship becomes defined by obsession, fear, or an inability to accept separation. One of the most discussed elements of the case was Jodi's changing explanations. From denying she was present, to describing unknown attackers, to claiming self-defense, the different versions became a central part of how people viewed her credibility. For investigators and prosecutors, those changes represented attempts to avoid responsibility. For supporters of Jodi, they represented a complicated response to trauma and fear. The debate continued long after the verdict. That is one reason the case remained part of true crime discussions years later. It was not only about what happened on June 4, 2008. It was about the psychological questions surrounding the relationship. It was about how two people could move from affection to conflict. It was about how emotions, when combined with instability and resentment, can create devastating consequences. But among all the discussions, one fact remained constant. Travis Alexander was the person who lost everything. His future was interrupted. His dreams ended. His family lost someone they loved. His friends lost someone they expected to see again. The world learned his name because of tragedy. But those closest to him wanted people to remember the entire person. They wanted people to remember the man who encouraged others. The man who worked hard. The man who believed in growth. The man who wanted to create a meaningful life. The final image of Travis should not be limited to a crime scene. It should include everything that came before. The childhood challenges he overcame. The career he built. The friendships he created. The hopes he carried. Because the true tragedy of a murder is not only the moment when a life ends. It is everything that life could have become. Every future possibility disappears. Every dream that was waiting to happen disappears. Every ordinary day that someone should have experienced disappears. Years after the verdict, the case of Travis Alexander continues to attract attention. People continue analyzing the evidence. People continue debating the motives. People continue discussing the trial. But beneath all of that is a simple human truth. A man named Travis Alexander had a life. He had people who cared about him. He had plans. He had a future. And that future was taken away. The legal system eventually reached its decision. The investigation ended. The trial concluded. But the questions surrounding human behavior, relationships, and warning signs continue. The story of Travis Alexander remains a reminder that behind every true crime case is not just a mystery to solve. There is a person to remember. And Travis Alexander deserves to be remembered not only because of how he died, but because of how he lived. Years after the courtroom battles ended and the cameras stopped following every movement inside the Arizona courthouse, the name Travis Alexander continued to echo. The details of the case remained unforgettable. The images. The testimony. The conflicting stories. The emotional arguments that divided public opinion. But beyond all of that was a deeper question that remained long after the verdict. What can be learned from the loss of a life that ended far too soon? True crime stories often focus on the person responsible. They focus on investigations, evidence, motives, and trials. They focus on the mystery of what happened. But every crime begins with a person who existed before the tragedy. A person with memories. A person with relationships. A person whose life mattered. For Travis Alexander, that life was filled with ambition, faith, friendships, and the desire to create something meaningful. The world came to know him because of a horrific event. But those who knew him wanted something different. They wanted people to understand that Travis was more than a victim. He was more than a name connected to a famous murder trial. He was a person. A person who had spent years trying to overcome challenges and build a better future. His story began long before June 4, 2008. It began with a young boy who experienced difficulties but refused to allow those difficulties to define him. It continued with a young man who discovered his strengths and used them to create opportunities. It continued with a professional who built relationships through communication and trust. It continued with a friend who made people laugh and encouraged others to believe in themselves. And it continued with a man who still had dreams waiting to be fulfilled. That is what makes the tragedy so painful. Because Travis was not someone who had stopped living. He was not someone who had abandoned his goals. He was actively building. He was planning. He was moving forward. At 30 years old, he was still at the beginning of many possibilities. He wanted a family. He wanted continued success. He wanted a future that reflected everything he had worked for. The murder ended not only a life but an entire collection of possibilities. The conversations Travis would never have. The places he would never visit. The memories he would never create. The people he would never meet. That is the invisible damage caused by violent crime. The impact does not stop at the moment of death. It spreads through families, friendships, and communities. For Travis's loved ones, the years after his death were filled with both grief and remembrance. They had to process the painful reality that someone they loved was gone while also watching the world analyze every detail of his personal life. The intense media attention surrounding the case created another layer of difficulty. Millions of people discussed Travis and Jodi without personally knowing either of them. The courtroom became a place where private moments were revealed publicly. Messages were read. Relationships were examined. Personal conflicts became evidence. For the people who loved Travis, it was not simply a legal case. It was the story of someone they knew. Someone whose voice they remembered. Someone whose presence had once been part of their everyday lives. This is one of the challenges of high-profile true crime cases. The public often sees the investigation. The public sees the trial. But families live with the aftermath. They live with the empty chair. The unanswered messages. The birthdays. The holidays. The ordinary moments when they remember the person who should still be there. The Travis Alexander case also became a subject of discussion because of the relationship dynamics involved. Many people examined the warning signs that appeared before the murder. The difficulty accepting a breakup. The inability to create emotional distance. The tension between wanting someone and wanting control over them. The case highlighted a painful reality. A relationship can become dangerous when love transforms into possession. Healthy relationships are built on respect, trust, and the ability to accept another person's choices. But when one person begins believing they have the right to control another person's life, emotions can become destructive. The tragedy of Travis Alexander is often discussed as an example of what can happen when emotional instability, resentment, and obsession reach an extreme level. However, it is also important to understand that difficult relationships do not automatically lead to violence. Most people experiencing heartbreak, jealousy, or emotional pain never harm another person. The warning signs are found not in normal human emotions, but in dangerous patterns of behavior. Patterns involving control, threats, intimidation, extreme reactions to rejection, the inability to respect boundaries. The case forced many people to reconsider how they view relationships. Sometimes the most important moments are not dramatic. They are the small signs that something is wrong. A person refusing to accept boundaries. A person demanding constant access to someone's life. A person reacting to separation as if it is an attack. Recognizing those signs can be important. Because prevention often begins before a crisis happens. The case also became an example of how modern technology can transform criminal investigations. The digital camera in Travis's home became one of the most important pieces of evidence. Technology preserved moments that would otherwise have disappeared. Photographs, digital information, electronic communication. These pieces allowed investigators to reconstruct a timeline and understand what happened. In many ways, the camera became a silent witness. It captured moments from a day that began normally but ended in tragedy. It showed the final chapter of Travis's life before the violence. And it helped investigators answer questions that might otherwise have remained unanswered. The trial itself also left a lasting impact on American true crime culture. The case demonstrated how a criminal trial could become a national event. Millions of people followed the testimony. People debated the evidence. They analyzed every statement. They formed opinions about the personalities involved. But beneath the fascination was a serious reminder. Real crimes involve real people. Real families. Real pain. The attention surrounding the case sometimes created a risk of forgetting that. A murder trial may become entertainment for outsiders, but for the victim's loved ones, it is a permanent tragedy. For Travis Alexander's family and friends, the most important goal was always remembering him. Not the crime. Not the headlines. Not the controversy. Him. The man who worked hard. The man who cared about others. The man who believed people could overcome their circumstances. The man who wanted to build a meaningful life. His story remains powerful because it represents something universal. Every person has dreams. Every person has relationships. Every person has a future that exists only in possibility. When a life is taken violently, that future disappears. The loss is not only measured by the years a person lived. It is measured by all the years they should have had. More than a decade after Travis Alexander's death, the case continues to attract attention because it raises difficult questions about love, obsession, trust, and human behavior. But perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest one. A person should never become a forgotten name behind a crime. Travis Alexander was not born to become a headline. He was not born to become evidence in a courtroom. He was not born to become part of a murder documentary. He was born to live. And for 30 years, he did. He laughed. He worked. He dreamed. He inspired people. He mattered. The tragedy is that his life ended in violence. But the legacy of Travis Alexander is not only the story of how he died. It is the story of who he was before that moment. A man who fought to overcome his past. A man who believed in a better future. A man whose journey was interrupted, but whose memory continues through the people who knew and loved him. The case of Travis Alexander remains one of the most haunting murder stories in modern American history. Not simply because of the crime. Not simply because of the trial. But because behind every piece of evidence was a human being. A human being named Travis Alexander. And remembering that humanity is the most important part of understanding this tragedy. In the years following the murder of Travis Alexander, countless people attempted to understand one of the most disturbing questions surrounding the case. How could a relationship that began with attraction, excitement, and affection end with one person dead and the other convicted of murder? There was no simple answer. Human relationships are complicated. Emotions are complicated. And when love becomes mixed with insecurity, rejection, and a desire for control, the consequences can become devastating. The story of Travis and Jody was not one that began with obvious danger. There was no immediate sign that their relationship would become one of the most discussed murder cases in America. At the beginning, it looked like many relationships do. Two people met. Two people became interested in each other. Two people believed they had found something special. That is what makes the ending so difficult to comprehend. The tragedy did not begin with a stranger entering Travis Alexander's life. It began with someone he once trusted. Someone who had shared his personal world. Someone who knew his hopes, his routines, and his dreams. The psychological questions surrounding the case became one of its most fascinating and disturbing aspects. Experts and observers examined the emotional patterns that appeared throughout their relationship. They looked at attachment. They looked at jealousy. They looked at control. They looked at the difficulty some people experience when they are forced to accept rejection or loss. A breakup is painful for almost everyone. It can create sadness, confusion, anger, a sense of failure. But most people eventually process those emotions and move forward. They understand that another person has the right to make choices. They accept that love cannot be forced. But in some situations, a person may begin seeing separation differently. Instead of viewing a breakup as the end of a relationship, they may see it as something unfair that must be corrected. The loss of another person's affection can become a threat to their identity. Their emotional stability can become connected entirely to whether that person stays or leaves. This was one of the central discussions surrounding Jodi Arias. According to prosecutors, Jodi struggled with the reality that Travis was moving on. They argued that she was unable to accept that he wanted a future beyond their relationship. They portrayed the murder as the final result of an emotional obsession that had continued to grow. The prosecution suggested that the crime was not simply about one argument or one moment. Instead, they argued that it was the result of months of emotional conflict. A pattern. A build-up. A relationship slowly moving toward destruction. But understanding psychology requires caution. Human behavior is rarely simple. A person's emotions, background, personality, and experiences all interact in complicated ways. No single event creates a violent act. No single emotion explains a crime. The important question is not only what someone felt. It is what they chose to do with those feelings. Throughout the investigation and trial, one of the most discussed issues was the idea of control. Relationships require boundaries. They require respect for another person's independence. A healthy relationship allows two people to exist as individuals while choosing to be together. But when one person begins believing they have ownership over another person's choices, the relationship can become unhealthy. Control can appear in subtle ways. Constant demands for attention. Difficulty accepting distance. Extreme reactions when someone sets boundaries. Attempts to interfere with another person's friendships or relationships. At first, these behaviors may be dismissed as signs of strong emotions. Some people may even confuse possessiveness with love. But love and control are not the same. Love allows freedom. Control demands possession. The Travis Alexander case became a painful example of how dangerous emotional dependence can become when it reaches an extreme level. Another major psychological element of the case was the changing explanations provided by Jodi Arias. From an investigative perspective, changing stories created serious questions. The first version denied her presence. The second introduced unknown attackers. The third acknowledged her presence but claimed self-defense. For prosecutors, these changes suggested manipulation. They argued that the story evolved only when evidence forced a new explanation. They believed each version was created to avoid responsibility. But the defense offered another interpretation. They argued that people experiencing extreme fear or trauma may not always describe events consistently. They suggested that memory and perception can be affected by emotional circumstances. The disagreement over these explanations became one of the most important battles during the trial. It showed how difficult it can be to understand human behavior after a traumatic event. People do not always react in predictable ways. They do not always communicate clearly. They do not always behave according to expectations. That complexity is part of what made the case so widely debated. Millions of people watched the trial and attempted to interpret every detail. They analyzed Jodi's expressions. They analyzed her words. They analyzed her behavior. Some people believed they saw manipulation. Others believed they saw someone overwhelmed by circumstances. The public reaction revealed something important about true crime cases. People are naturally drawn to explanations. They want to understand why terrible things happen. They want clear answers. They want to know what separates ordinary conflict from dangerous behavior. But human psychology does not always provide simple answers. The relationship between Travis and Jodi remains one of the most examined parts of the case because it represents a situation many people recognize. A relationship that changed. A breakup that created pain. Two people who wanted different things. The difference is that most relationships end without tragedy. Most people experience heartbreak and survive it. Most people walk away. The devastating question in this case is why this situation ended differently. Why did a relationship that once involved affection become connected to violence? Why did emotions that began with attraction transform into anger and destruction? Those questions continue to be studied because they reflect broader concerns about human relationships. The case serves as a reminder that warning signs should not be ignored. Not every uncomfortable behavior predicts violence. But patterns of control, intimidation, and inability to respect boundaries should always be taken seriously. The people around Travis later described moments that made them uncomfortable. Looking back after the murder, those moments appeared more significant. Friends wondered whether warning signs had been visible before the tragedy. They wondered whether something could have been done differently. This is one of the most painful experiences for families after violent crimes. The search for answers often becomes a search through the past. People replay conversations. They revisit memories. They ask themselves questions that may never have answers. Could something have been prevented? Could someone have noticed more? Could a different decision have changed everything? These questions are natural. But they also show the deep impact of losing someone unexpectedly. For Travis's loved ones, the tragedy was not only about understanding Jodi. It was about living with the absence of Travis. The psychology of the case may explain certain behaviors. It may help investigators understand motives. It may help society recognize warning signs. But it can never fully explain the loss of a person. Because behind every psychological theory is a human story. A man who wanted a future. A man who had goals. A man who believed his life was still unfolding. The most important lesson from examining the psychology behind the case is not simply understanding the person responsible. It is understanding the value of recognizing unhealthy patterns before they become dangerous. The tragedy of Travis Alexander reminds people that relationships should be built on respect, not possession. On trust, not control. On freedom, not fear. Because when those foundations disappear, the consequences can be devastating. And in the quiet streets of Mesa, Arizona, the consequences of that failure became permanent. A promising life ended. A family was left grieving. And a nation was left trying to understand how love could transform into one of the most shocking crimes of the modern era.